This session is about a book named Just Passing Through, a 7-decade Roman holiday, the Diaries and Photographs of Milton Gendel. You ask, who is Milton Gendel? He's probably, per the New York Times, the most cultivated person you've never heard of. Who he was is a photographer and confidant, or was, a photographer and confidant of some of the most creative and storied personalities of the 70s and 80s. Just to name a few of his friends, they included Gore Vidal, Peggy Guggenheim, Princess Margaret, Stephen Spender, and Anne Glenconer. And that's just the tip of the iceberg, as you're going to find out. Lucky for me, I came across this book via Milton's daughter, Anna Gendel Mathias, who turns out she lives in Missley, Essex, which suited my purposes beautifully. So of course I couldn't help but invite her to EA Festival. She safe-kept the diaries of her father for many years before turning them over to star editor Cullen Murphy, who today is joining us from the East Coast of the United States just for this talk. Cullen served as the Atlantic's managing editor from 1985 to 2006, then became editor-at-large of Vanity Fair for more than 10 years. He also co-wrote the comic strip Prince Valiant, which was drawn by his father, the illustrator John Cullen Murphy, a really interesting and quirky factoid. Today, Cullen and Anna are going to give us a glimpse into the life of Milton Gendel through his photos and Anna's recollections. Please welcome Anna, Mathias, and Cullen Murphy.
Thank you so much. It's really wonderful to be here at the EA Festival. I did get in this morning at 6:55 a.m., but it's not just for this. I'm going to have dinner too, and then go. I'd like to start with two questions and get one little bit of reading out of the way. The first question is one that was asked and I would just like to go a little bit deeper into it, and that is, who was Milton Gendel? And then the second one has to do with, and why is it called Just Passing Through? So just this one paragraph to help place Milton. Placing Milton Gendel, defining his life, his work, his context, his role, is not a conventional task. He was a photographer, a critic, a sounding board, a facilitator, a convener, a collector. Asked why he had chosen to spend his life in Rome, he would generally reply that he was just passing through, which is what everybody is doing in Rome, whether they know it or not. His various homes in the city were certainly a destination for others passing through, writers and artists, actors and journalists, aristocrats and arrivistes, and members of what used to be called the jet set. To know Gendel was to achieve one degree of separation from an improbable array of characters. Some of these are people you will have heard of: Diana Cooper, Mark Rothko, Princess Margaret, Andre Breton, Babe Paley, Robert Motherwell, et cetera, et cetera. There are thousands. And others are people who've left no footprint, but just the people that he knew in Rome. And we selected this picture as the cover because it kind of says "just passing through." It's a picture of Princess Margaret. You can actually see through the wicker. She's in Rome at the time. And what this note from the introduction says about Milton as being somebody who was just passing through can also be said about all of the people that he knew there. They too are just passing through his life. So before we jump into the pictures, Anna, I wonder if you could tell us something about just what the body of material is that we are dealing with here, both the diaries and the photographs.
Yes, so the photographs are tens and thousands of negatives, which my father left to a scholarly foundation in Rome. They now own the rights to the photographs. But fortunately for me, and not so much for them, my father left me the albums, 60 albums, which Cullen and I spent some time looking through to get initial shape for the book. Then in terms of his diary, he always wrote a diary way back. There are fragments from the 30s, but he really got going with some momentum in the 60s. And so from about 1966 through to his death in 2018, there are 9 filing cabinet drawers in Manningtree, Mistley, Bradfield, Essex, which contain his diary. They're typewritten, tightly spaced, sometimes 5 sides for a day. Everything is in them: world events, what he ate, gossip, his sex life in pretty full detail. And so, someone was very kindly saying, "Oh, you know, so fascinating to read them," and it was. But I have to admit that I was completely wicked in that I read them long before he allowed me to read them. I read them, you know, over 20 years before he died. And the only thing I would say, it's not really a justification, but the good element of my wickedness was that it did allow me to learn how much he loved me. He was, you know, he was American. He was born in 1918, and part of the sort of social mores of that time was that, you know, you adopted wasp mannerisms, and you weren't gushing or particularly affectionate. But he was in the diary, which was lovely.
I, of course, had none of that personal baggage that that Anna had. I had gotten to know Milton before I knew Anna. I was going to Rome very frequently. Friends of friends had put me in touch with Milton. I would see him whenever I went to Rome, and eventually he began leaving bits of diaries out for me to read, knowing that I was working at a magazine, and possibly a magazine might be interested in putting the diaries and the photographs together, which is how Anna and I met. We'll come to that in a bit. To me, one of the problems with the diaries, or one of the opportunities, is that they are so voluminous. There's 10 million words here. He would write at least 500 words a night from 1950 up until 2019, when he died at almost the age of 100. It's a huge amount of material. And how do you? I mean, we can't sit at Nether Hall and read 10 million words. And the approach that we eventually settled on was, it was kind of like, you know, when archaeologists make a trench through a burial mound. And we did something like that, just picking up a period of a decade, and just trying to look at that very, very closely. So can we see the next picture here? So this is Milton. This is a Milton that neither Anna nor I knew. This is 1950. He has just arrived in Rome. The picture is taken by a woman named Josephine Powell, one of only 2 photographs you'll see today that are not by Milton. I love this photograph because he just looks so, so confident and astonishing. He looks like he's stepped out of an Ayn Rand movie. And but Anna, can you tell us something about the background, whose studio this is, and why that's important?
Certainly. So the studio is Alberto Burri's studio, and they had a wonderful symbiotic friendship, really, because Burri had already made his name as an important painter of abstract expression in Rome, very indebted to the New York School, which my father was fundamentally based in before and in the early years of the war. But this article that my father wrote for Art News, which was called Burri Paints a Picture, and it was one of a series of Art News articles which really explained the mechanics of painting, particularly more abstract painting. And Cullen, I so agree with you that there is an element of Rand here, and I think it speaks to a part of my father's character where his moving to Rome in 1949 enabled him really to some extent reinvent himself, although he didn't really reinvent himself. What he managed to do was that he managed to carve out a sort of territory for himself where he was the subject, and he really disliked any kind of labeling. He was Jewish. God forbid you should call him Jewish. He was proud of being a New Yorker. He was a Jeffersonian Democrat, he would say with great conviction. Any mention of class, worse than being Jewish. So he was him, and he liked this rather sort of mid-century cultural imperialism of his own, really.
This picture always reminds me of something that Gore Vidal said about Milton. There's in the diary. Gore and Milton spent a lot of time together, and Milton had Gore's number. It was not as if Milton didn't know what Gore Vidal was really like. But there's a time when Milton, who's dressed someone like that, according to the diaries, the car is broken down. Gore Vidal, of course, is not going to change the tire, and Milton gets out to change the tire, and so he's there in his khakis, his white shirt. He's got the jack, the tire, and Gore Vidal says to him as he's repairing the tire, when I see you like this, I realize how American you are. And anyway, I just imagine it was that kind of a youngish Milton who's like that. Can we have the next picture? So this is by Milton, as all the rest will be. Piazza Mattei in Rome. It was the location in this piazza was one of the palazzos that Milton lived in, and a place that you would know very well. From the time he got to Rome, and really almost instantly, he was on a Guggenheim Fellowship. He'd been with the Surrealists in New York for a good while before going off to the war. But from the time he got to Rome, he always had some kind of palatial hidey hole as his abode, and sometimes more than one at the same time. There must have been 4 or 5 over the course of his lifetime, and the most central one was on Tiber Island, where he must have had that place for 3 decades,
Yes,
or so. This is the famous turtle fountain, and it's being cleaned. There's a whole series of photographs in Milton's scrapbooks documenting that. But the piazza itself very well.
Yes, I do, and you're absolutely right. I mean, he photographed it in all sorts of conditions and situations. He particularly loved these restorations, and thank God he was there as this sea creature was being hoisted off, because it really gave him the material for some of his most wonderful photographs. But it's a leitmotif that runs all the way through his oeuvre, really, doesn't it?
It does, yeah. Next. All right, so there's Lady Diana Cooper. When I look at the previous photograph, you see a statue that is almost as if it's alive. There's something sometimes about some of the portraits that Milton does of people that make them, in a different way, seem statuesque. I've always liked that reversal that he's able to achieve. But one reason I wanted to show this picture is because Diana Cooper represents the kind of person who was at the center of Milton's world. I began to see the social circle around him as consisting of these nodes of society, each person representing a different node. Someone like Diana Cooper, was certainly at the center of a vast and diverse set, and there are many people like her who were part of Milton's circle. One thing I especially love about that portrait is the cigarette down by her thigh. It's almost as if she's kind of daring you to decide: am I hiding the cigarette or am I calling attention to it? It's such a stylish move. But you knew Diana Cooper.
I did, and I owe her a great deal because she introduced my parents. After Duff Cooper died, after the war, she would spend quite a lot of time in Rome visiting her friend Jenny Cross, who was the daughter of Robert Graves. And she and her husband Patrick Cross were journalists in Rome. Patrick ran Reuters there. And on one of these visits in the early 50s, Diana met my father, who was also a great friend of Jenny and Patrick Cross's. And she thought, great, this is the man for her goddaughter, my mother, Judy, who her heart had been broken in the war when her almost fiancé was shot down in 1941. She'd had many broken hearts since then, and And when they met, thanks to Diana, it started a very intense friendship, which eventually did develop into a love affair and marriage in 1962. But Diana was a great figure in my childhood. She was completely fascinating and witty and warm in quite a forbidding way. My abiding memory of her, pretty much where she's standing there, is her looking at me rather coldly and saying, "Stop picking your nose."
That's a great phrase, warm in a forbidding way.
So,
Not many people can pull that off. Another. Now, so a character sketch of Babe Paley would be helpful here, Anna, too.
Yes.
This, like Diana Cooper, Babe Paley is another one of those people who occupy just a dense and active node in society. She was one of the Cushing sisters, and her husband was Bill Paley, who was the head of CBS. Again, people who are coming in and out of Milton's life and your life. And one of the things about Milton is the way he took pictures. It's clear when you see any of his photographs that he is a person who is part of the scene. He's not an outsider who's been brought in to record the scene. He's somebody who has, minutes before was probably sitting there having a glass of wine, having lunch, and he got up, took his camera, just walked away, took some pictures, and probably is going to be back there again in a minute. But in the meantime, he captures this regal pose of Babe Paley's. Babe?
Well, one of the reasons I really love this photograph is that you're absolutely right. I mean, I don't think Babe Paley could do anything without looking absolutely beautiful and poised and just commanding everybody's eye. She was so beautiful and she was so nice. She was warm and funny and intimate and just great. But on the far left of the picture frame is my mother smoking. My mother made great friends with the Cushing sisters, I think because they shared a sense of humor. I mean, a really riotous sense of humor, a pretty edgy and audacious sense of humor, and a great love of chat and gossip and a good time. And they really made her life in America during the 40s just wonderful. But my mother was the opposite of Babe Paley in that she was probably the least vain person you would ever meet in your life. She knew that she was not a pretty or elegant woman in any terms whatsoever, and she just kind of almost airbrushed that element of her persona out. So sitting there smoking a cigarette in a headscarf and not interested in the gaze of a photographer at all, whereas Babe does. But that doesn't make Babe a prima donna. She was wonderful because she wasn't, in a way.
We'll have the next photograph, but just one quick other note about Babe Paley. That gaze of hers that Anna is referring to. So I've seen probably, 8, 9 pictures of Babe Paley in the photographic scrapbooks, and always with different people. And in each one of those photographs, the other people are doing something. They're looking at a book, they're eating, they're interacting with each other. And in every single photograph, Babe Paley's face is turned and faces the camera. It's like one of those Renaissance paintings, where there's always one figure who is not looking at the battle and or not looking at the coronation. Is just turned to the viewer, and that's always Babe Paley. This is Peggy Guggenheim in her palazzo in Venice. And Peggy, as I've come to know her, and Milton were great friends, going back to the New York days and the surrealist circles. Peggy in the late 1930s was the person who, literally airlifted artists and writers out of Europe to basically the Greenwich Village in New York as the war began to bear down. And then, of course, had this, immensely influential life as a collector. That's in her palazzo. I don't know who the painter is, but you can see that in the lower right there's a Alexander Calder mobile, and on the table there's a Giacometti. And what I love about this photograph is that this is just her house. I mean, the way she's walking through it, it's not as if she's, saying, look at this. It's, where did I leave my glasses? And Peggy is one of the characters, like Babe Paley, who comes through the pages, often.
Yes, she does. I love the cowboy boots, and I think it's an art. I think it's a léger, but anyone who knows better can let me know. Dina thinks it's a léger too, which is great. So the cowboy boots are wonderful, and there's another woman who was not beautiful, but she was very clearly very seductive, judging by the amount of men she seduced. Including, it appears, my father, from a recent reading of some handwritten diary, which we sadly didn't have the opportunity to look at before Cullen's book came out. Sorry.
Could we have used it, do you think?
Oh, I don't think anyone would care now, would they? Maybe Monica would care. Maybe. Anyway, so very, very seductive, and again, my father's timing on catching this figure all dressed in white, set against that dark doorway, maybe in a slightly menacing way as well. But no, I think they were friends, and it was nice that they had shared this background in New York as well.
You know that family?
Yes. Although I must say, not Gianni Agnelli as much as his wife's family, who, to my mind, were sort of in a way more interesting. But in fact, this photograph is taken at Garavicchio, a house which belonged to his wife and two brothers-in-law on the border of Lazio and Tuscany. It's a really, really charming old farmhouse with fantastic views, and later on a Niki da San Fal sculpture garden underneath it. And just, one of those fantastically informal shots of my father's sort of capturing Gianni Agnelli in full flow, chatting away. And I think capturing some sense of his charm and dynamism, don't you think?
I think so. One thing I enjoyed about this project was just looking through the photographic scrapbooks, and they are very special in a particular way because Milton's imprint is so deeply impressed on them. The foundation that Anna referred to earlier in Rome, the Fondazione Primoli, has 72,000 negatives. But every year, Milton would go through and edit the photographs that he had taken that year. And he would create a scrapbook, which is about this thick, and perhaps it would have 100 pages of thick cardboard. And he would go through and make prints of the photographs that he liked, that he wanted to be sure had front place. And he would lay them down, he would carefully annotate them, and then he would bring the cardboard sheets to a binder who would make leather covers for them. And he did this, you must have, 50 volumes or more?
Yes.
And this clearly, it was like someone putting down the very best wine for the future. He was putting down the very best photographs. And so when you go through it, it's just one photograph after another like this. This is the life that I'm living. It's not surprising with a diary, but the immediacy of experiencing Milton's life in the context of the people is something that comes through from both the diaries and the photographs.
No.
All right, so here is this Evelyn Waugh and Diana Cooper and Babs Johnson, who's she wrote under what?
Georgina Masson.
Georgina Masson.
Yeah.
Anna, you have a particular story about Evelyn Waugh, but but tell us first though about the location. It's a picnic at is it Villa Pamphili?
Yes, yes. So Villa Pamphili was still belonged to Vittorio Pamphili's in the early 60s. This photograph dates from 1963. And Diana Cooper, on these many trips to Rome, would often come with Evelyn Waugh, and Waugh was there to make his devotions. And this was around the time of Easter week. Babs Johnson, who was wonderful. She was a daughter of Empire. She'd been to the Royal College for the Daughters of the Officers of the British Empire in Bath. And she was somewhat forbidding, but she was incredibly kind to me as a child. And she lived in a it was a little bit like a garden shed, to be honest, in the Villa Doria. But of course, she'd made it absolutely lovely, and she lived there on a peppercorn rent until she didn't. And Evelyn Waugh, literally around the days of this photograph, he and my father did not get on. Waugh was not particularly impressed by Jews, and my father, I think, sensed it, and he was a snob, and so my father sensed that. And he walked into the sitting room in this house on the island one day to find me in my crib. I'd been born in the January of 63, and Waugh, who had my tiny little hand in his, and he was making the sign of a cross over my baby form. Well, not popular with my father, sort of a tantamount to child abuse, Rosemary's Baby scenario. And so that was my great meeting with literature.
Waugh does show up quite a bit in the diaries, and there is no love lost. It's not analogous to the feelings about Gore Vidal, where there's a kind of affection, there's an appreciation of his talent and his humor, and then there's also a kind of disgust. With Waugh, it's more or less on an even keel of, do I have to? And he is quoted, for instance, Waugh is quoted speaking in dialect when he's, trying to mimic what Waugh would see as a Jewish accent, or when Waugh is trying to say something in the words of a gay person. This is the kind of thing that Milton just hated, and it's all reproduced in the diaries. Waugh doing this kind of thing.
Yeah. Yes, Waugh called my father the inglorious Milton as well, behind his back, which wasn't great.
Just one quick housekeeping note, and that is, if you do have questions, we certainly can talk afterwards. But we were hoping to leave a little bit of time aside, as a group, maybe in 5 minutes or 10 minutes, if you have questions now. Antonia Fraser, the one thing you get from both the diaries and the photographs is the notion of this movable feast of Milton and his friends, based in Rome, but coming many places, coming to London, going to the English countryside, going to Greece. This is Greece.
Yes.
And Antonia Fraser, now 90?
Now 90, just 90 this year. Yes. And yes, staying with Michael and Anne Tree, the parents of Isabella Tree, who's a speaker at the EA Festival in the autumn, by the way. And Antonia looking, absolutely radiant and lovely. And it's a sort of the capacity of my father to photograph people in a very intimate way, I suppose, being barefoot, being in her dressing gown, and she really was so lovely. So, and still is.
I'm sure.
Yeah.
Next. All right. There's we know who that is, Gore Vidal, and say what one will. Every time he steps into the diaries, it is always hugely entertaining, whether he's being, an oaf. He's kind of a scintillating oaf. And so I from the outset, I knew that when we were putting this book together, a leitmotif from these years was going to be the presence of Gore Vidal. But the incidents are often so improbable. There's one time where Milton and Vidal are having dinner at a restaurant, and Vidal has his dog with him. And at one point, Vidal allows the dog to lick his own teeth. And Milton says, "Well, what's that about?" And Vidal says, "Well, I'm told that a dog's saliva is good for your teeth." To which Milton says, or at least he said, "And what happens to the dog's teeth after?" Next one. This is actually Anna. I just wanted to see if I was going to get an off. You were what, 4? 5?
I think I was 4. Yes.
And that's at Peggy Guggenheim's, and you're nobody is there to say don't touch the Calder. But there's a story about Alexander Calder, which is one of my favorites. So if you went to Milton's any of Milton's palazzo hideaways, in his bedroom you would see a framed pair of shoes, and the soles were white. And there's a Calder story that goes with this, which was we actually have the picture. Why don't you just, okay? There's those are the framed shoes. You can see Milton in between the two soles. You can see a bit of his head. So he's out to dinner one night with Calder, and on the way to the restaurant, he has stepped in some white paint, by accident, so that the bottom of his shoes are white. So then they go to the restaurant, and Milton has his feet up on another chair. And then what happens, Anna?
So, and then Calder portrays him. So as you can see on your left, full face with a signature, and on your right, profile with a signature. And so when dinner came to an end, my father whipped his shoes off and tucked them under his arm, and Calder said, "What are you doing?" And he said, "What do you think I'm doing?" So
that is Princess Margaret on the left, and a Vatican curator on the right, and of course it's the Sistine Chapel. And Princess Margaret is another person who comes in and out of the diaries in a major way, and not in the way that she typically comes in and out of other books. Yes, she can sometimes be hard to handle, but she's also curious, she's also funny, she's also very warm and caring with respect in particular to you. I love this photograph because of the way she is listening so intently to the Vatican curator. This is the moment when the Sistine Chapel is being restored in the 1990s. And the image of, I think it's one of the Sibyls in the background there, just hovering over this conversation. The Sistine Chapel ceiling has been brought down to human scale in a way as a subject of conversation. We have one other photograph, a less serious photograph of Princess Margaret. But Anna, perhaps you can say something not about this photograph, just about her.
Sure, absolutely. So my mother had made great friends with Princess Margaret in the early 50s. They were in a charity play together, and they really bonded. I mean, maybe it was because my mother wasn't a sort of, because of this lack of vanity, this lack of glamour, she was, I think they really bonded on a friendship which had no, my mother certainly wasn't going to compete with Princess Margaret for beauty or glamour. And I think they made each other laugh, and they loved gossip, and they had a really cozy friendship. And so Princess Margaret became my godmother. And when my mother died, really quite young, age 49 in 1972, Princess Margaret was just amazing as a family friend. She set to. my mother had died in London, we were in Rome, and Cullen's very kindly published an extent of diary where my father describes this whole process, which is incredibly moving. And we go immediately to Kensington Palace, where she put us up and looked after us. And thereafter, she did that. She was extremely kind to us as friends. She was very sort of protective. I mean, she gave the idea that I was in a sort of slightly magic circle, which I really wasn't, but it was a lovely idea to have proffered one. I suppose one of the things that I think is such a shame is that, of course, we all enjoy the crown, but it definitely has left a representation of Princess Margaret which is very two-dimensional. I'm not going to tell you that she didn't enjoy a drink like all of her generation. You know, the day was structured around drink before lunch. Well, actually, in later years, not a drink before lunch, but a drink in the evening, cocktail, and all of that, as my father did, as my mother did, as I'm sure many of your parents did. But she wasn't a sort of drop-down, sloppy drunk who kind of careered, from wall to wall as she's depicted in The Crown. That just wasn't it at all. She was also a woman, an incredibly complex woman, as Cullen has indicated, somebody who was extremely bright and had a huge appetite and interest in art and history. So another of the sort of themes through the albums and the diaries, which is very charming, is the historical treats. Princess Margaret would say to my father, "Come and stay, and we'll do a historical treat." And it would be going to Houghton, or going to the Tower of London, or going to the Windsor Library, and the whole visit would be structured around the historical treat. And then my father would say, well, next summer, the historical treat will be to go to Urbino, or it'll be to go to Piedmont. And so they had this lovely sort of you know the one, about sharing England and Italy as historical treats. And one day her diaries, which will give an account of all these trips and all the knowledge that she accumulated during these trips, will come to light, and they'll show another light of her, which I think is a shame that isn't known. And by the way, she was also a woman of incredibly deep faith. I mean, again, we know that she was a good time girl, but she also had a deep and abiding faith. One of the rather comical elements of my relationship with her was that maybe it was Evelyn Waugh, but once I married, I converted to Catholicism. And I had 10 godparents, 5 godmothers, 5 godfathers, and of all the godparents, Princess Margaret was the one who summoned me to lunch, horrified that I was converting to Catholicism. I mean, really, really unhappy that I was converting to Catholicism. And when I said, I'm really sorry, I've done this for the following reasons, and it's done, she said, well, you can always come back. And judging by the state of the church, I might one day.
That's what the Catholics say to the Anglicans all the time.
Yeah, exactly.
We have a couple more pictures left. We just have a few more minutes, and we'll be around for questions, but it just might be fun to see a few more photographs. Obviously, Lord Snowdon there with Andre Leon Talley. Milton didn't usually take fashion photographs. This was, I think, a job for W magazine, or was it?
Well, I think he snuck in on the sidelines.
While the
fashion shoot was happening. Yes, exactly.
Yes, and got the outtakes.
Yes, exactly.
And J. Paul Getty, and well, why don't we move on from that one? And the late Queen at Balmoral. This is kind of an iconic photograph. There's a whole series. There was a long week that you spent at Balmoral in the mid '70s.
Yes.
And there are a lot of just like family photographs that Milton took from that weekend. And nobody's doing anything remarkable. They're lying around. They're having picnics. They're out with their Land Rovers. And this one with the corgis, feeding the corgis, has always been one of my favorites. And what was it that she said to you about the corgis?
So at one point, I said, oh, ma'am, one of the corgis, whatever it was called, has got a tick. And she looked at me and said, well, pull it off. Okay.
Very matter of fact.
Yeah, exactly. Absolutely. Problem, solution.
You know, as you saw with that picture of Princess Margaret in the bathtub, Milton had a kind of subversive attitude towards royalty sometimes. I mean, this is a royal. This is Marcus Aurelius, the emperor. And when his statue was being restored in the 1980s, it was taken off the Capitol in Rome and sent for, you know, for rehabilitation. And they had him in the back of a pickup truck going through the streets of Rome. And so Milton, in his scrapbooks, you'll see an entire sequence of the statue being, you know, taken off his horse, put into the back, wrapped in plastic, driven through the streets of Rome as if he's, you know, Il Duce, and then weeks later or months later, when the restoration is done, coming back and having a triumphal procession back to the Capitol to his, you know, final resting place. And we can stop with this one. One of the earliest pictures that Milton took in Rome. This is 1950. It's on the Via Appia Antica, and it's a self-portrait. The shadow is Milton. In the background, you see the aqueducts, you see the countryside. You know, I love the way that certain things are united in this picture. One is Milton is in the picture, but he's not, in a way, visible himself in the picture, which seems to characterize a lot of his photography. You know, it's not about him, and yet he's clearly there. And, you know, a picture like that just underlines that point. It's also such a beautiful composition. And it's a photograph that I've always loved.
Yes, I mean, I must say, having been to Rome 2 weeks ago, where it was, you know, I've never, ever seen it so crowded. It was very, very, very crowded, and everybody agreed they'd never seen it so crowded. I think one of the things that my father's photographs really reveal is how incredibly lucky that generation were, in that they'd had some sense of pre-war life, which would have been fascinating. They fought a completely justifiable war, at least through their eyes, with the liberation of the camps. They then enjoyed the best of technology without any guilt as to the environmental issues around them, and they, you know, they were incredibly lucky that they travelled at a time when you could look at sort of great vistas in Italy. They went to Jordan and Israel and Palestine, and the photographs are just wonderful because they're empty.
And smoking and drinking didn't kill you back then.
That's very true.
Anna, it's been a privilege to be able to work with you on this book and to plow through this material with you or by my side.
Well,
so thank you.
And absolutely right back at you, Cullen, because it takes somebody who you can trust implicitly with the most intimate account of your family's life. Cullen was super generous. He gave me complete right of veto on the diaries, so that there were lots of really juicy bits, which I would ring up and say, "Oh, I haven't slept all night. Can we take it out?" And he'd say,
"I
yes.
made copies for all of you."
So it's been a wonderful process. Thank you.
And thanks to all of you.
Thank you.